wiki says about Schuler tuning. All right. So it says Schuler tuning is a modification to the electronic control system used in inertial navigation systems. Now this is important right here, and we'll address this in a second. That accounts for the curvature of the Earth. Okay, an inertial navigation system used in submarines, ships, aircraft, and other vehicles to keep track of position determines directions with respect to three axes pointing northeast and down to detect To detect a vehicle's orientation, the system contains an inertial platform mounted on gimbals with gyroscopes that keep it pointing in a fixed orientation in space. However, the directions northeast and down change as the vehicle moves on the curved surface of the Earth. Schuler tuning describes the modifications necessary to an inertial navigation system to keep the inertial platform always pointing northeast, south, down, yada, yada, yada. Okay, well, first of all, we have to look and say, okay, well, what's the inertial navigation system? Okay, so we look at that. So an INS is a navigation aid that uses a computer, first and foremost, and that is also huge. Motion sensors, accelerometers, and rotation sensors, gyroscopes, to continuously calculate via dead reckoning the position, orientation, and velocity of a moving object without the need for external references. Okay, so let me break this down and tell you what this is actually saying. All right, so before I do that, let's jump over here to the other thing that it talked about, inertial platform, which is basically a gyroscopic platform or a stabilized platform using gyroscopes to maintain a platform in a fixed orientation in space, blah, 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 blah. Okay, but let's go back to this. So what they're talking about here is Schuler tuning is a system that describes modification to an inertial navigation system, which, first of all, an inertial navigation system, as we have already described, requires the use of a computer. All right, well, that, first of all, should raise a lot of red flags to anybody that was a pilot before 25 years ago, which would be me, and many, many other people on the Earth. And the reason being is because we were not using computers in our aircraft at that time or any time since the Wright brothers to compensate for the curvature of the Earth. It's utterly nonsense. Okay, so what it's doing, what they're saying is that this modification brought about by Schuler tuning, which is using a computer to affect a navigation system. Now, first of all, let me tell you what the navigation system is that they're describing. These navigation systems are not in use in most aircraft today. They are in use in a large amount of the airliners, but as far as to the total percentage of all aircraft on Earth, not even a drop in the bucket, okay? So what this is saying is that the inertial navigation system, which would be a complete autopiloting system, which would allow you to take off, fly your route, do your landing, all that stuff, all by computer control automatically. It is the Schuler tuning that is a procedure that describes how to modify an already existing internal navigation system to compensate for the curvature of the Earth, whether it be from GPS data, which, by the way, is not existent for that particular function, or some other methodology, which there is another methodology, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. But the bottom line is it's talking about modifying an existing navigation system that would be of the high order of technology anyway, that never even existed before 25, 30 years ago. Okay, so even if it were true, which it isn't, but even if it were true that it were modifying the orientation of the gyros to keep consistent with so that the gyroscope is at a constant 90-degree angle perpendicular to the center point of the Earth, which would be directly below it, there is no way to necessarily do this. And I can tell you that all navigation systems, that are not navigation systems, but navigation equipment that most airplanes use, which is a gyroscope for your artificial horizon, for your turn and slip indicator, for your rate of climb, All of those are based on straight up gyroscopes with absolutely no modification to them to change any orientation to the gyro itself to compensate uh, for gravity or for the curvature of the Earth, because the whole idea is to keep the gyroscope plane at a perfect 90-degree angle to the spot that's directly below you that goes all the way to the center of the Earth. Okay, so first of all, Schuler tuning is not even used in the majority of these systems. Now, another thing that they will talk about is there's another type of gyro that is fairly new, not hugely new, but that uses, instead of electric motors to power up the flywheel on the gyroscope, it uses vanes and air pressure. Okay, so another model that came up, and I was discussing this with Curious Life of a Flat Earther, that he caught a lot of rebuttal on, was these vanes that are supposedly in the bottom, not supposedly, they actually are there, I will admit that, at the bottom of the gyroscopic structure that take the air that is blown across the vanes that spin the gyro, and according to gravity, or the orientation of the plane, it will open one of 4 air gates to be able to discharge the air that is spinning up the gyro. Well, that's all great. Now, first of all, like I said, this is something that's relatively new. Before that, they simply used electric motors to spin up the gyros. However, there are magnetic fields and other things that can cause problems with that, even though they work well for the most part. This air drive is supposedly a better system. So great. But what they're saying then is that if you modify the aircraft, okay, its trajectory or its angle, that what will happen is that the gyro will stay rigid in space, because that's what gyros do. They stay rigid in space no matter what the orientation of the plane is around it, okay? But they're saying that when you go into like a 60-degree turn, for example, the gyroscope is going to stay rigid in space, but because the air vane that is discharging the air that is spinning up the gyro is kind of at the sump of the gyroscopic mechanism, that it will open one of 4 corresponding gates, one for each direction, northeast, southwest, and it will kind of force the line of gravity so that the gyroscope goes back to a perfect 90-degree perpendicular line to an imaginary line that goes down to the center of the Earth. Well, first of all, that's silly, because if you could do that simply by blowing air across some sort of a gate, you've got to take into consideration a million other factors, like what is the resistance of that gate to the air? In other words, what if it's sticky? How much air is actually going across it? You have surface contacts. You have a million things that have to be taken into consideration. But as far as it making any type of precision adjustment, that's simply impossible. What it actually does, what these air gates actually do, is they act as a dampening system. There are 2 mechanisms in a gyro that prevents it from spinning around in circles, and that is, if you're in an aerobatics plane and you do a roll or a loop or something like that, obviously the cage would be rotating all the way around the gyroscope, and it would cause everything to kind of run amok. But what they do is they put limits in on the gimbals that hold the gyroscope, so that once you go past 60 or 70 degrees, something like that, or maybe even more, there's a mechanical lock there that prevents it from going any further. Okay, now what the air pressure does going through those relief gates at the bottom, those discharge gates, is it acts more of a dampening mechanism, so that you don't have such a wildly gyrating artificial horizon when you've come out of some sort of a high-speed maneuver that requires a lot of banking or hard turning or something like that. So the bottom line is that neither the air vanes at the bottom of the air-driven gyroscopes used to exist in the past. They were all motor-driven. And secondly, the computers to drive inertial navigation systems are only something that, in the past few decades that have come about to even be able to allow an airplane to be computer controlled. And so what happened to the 60 or 70 years before that when pilots were flying international flights, yada, yada, yada? In other words, the whole idea of the Schuler tuning of a navigation system that hasn't existed except for the last few decades is utter bullshit, okay? So what gyroscopes really do is their claim to fame is they have a rigidity in space, okay? Now, you can buy a gyroscope. People have used gyroscopes for years. They're toys. They also make extremely high-end gyroscopes that are precision machined that will run for a long, long time, 20, 30 minutes, you know, on a spin. They also have them now where you can use little electric motors externally to spin them up to around 8,000 RPM. Well, this is something that was never done, that never able to be done, you know, back in the days of antiquity when, for example, Foucault did his gyroscopic experiments. And Foucault is kind of credited for all of this, by the way. Not only was his pendulum bullshit, but he also lied about his results on gyroscopes. And I guess where I'm going with this is there's a Navy video, and I've got it here, and I will actually also post this. And where is it? The Navy video, Navy video. That's not it. Okay, but that is. Okay, so here's the Navy aviation training film. And what they say in this makes perfect logical sense for any gyro. And they say that because gyros maintain a rigidity in space, that you can change the orientation of the gimbals all around them that are attached to it, but the gyro will stay right there, okay? So Foucault allegedly did an experiment where he and his cheesy 200-year-old gyro, supposedly, he was able to spin it up and actually see precession in the gyro, which would have indicated and proved motion, angular motion most specifically, brought about by the rotation of the Earth. Well, that's all fine and dandy, except that everybody that has performed this experiment since he's done it, and with far better equipment, has failed to get any results that even remotely come close to what Foucault claimed that he had. A good example, Rob Durham bought an extremely high precision gyroscope, did the precession test. Guess what? He let it run for, well, quite a while, and he had calculated the precession based on his latitude, and of course the gyroscope did not move at all. There is another guy, Yeoman P, that here's his video where he let it run for 6 hours and it detected absolutely zero motion. Well, a lot of people came back and their debunks was, well, the gyroscope simply was not sensitive enough to measure this movement of the Earth, which is of course ludicrous, because if Foucault could do it, you know, several hundred years ago with his cheesy gyroscopes, the notion that we couldn't replicate it today with high-end, you know, 21st century engineered gyroscopes, and also we have the advantage of motors, which will keep that gyro spinning continuously, and we still cannot duplicate it. That tells me that Foucault lied. It also tells me that if in our airplane, you know, going back to my Cessna that I rented years ago when I was first getting my private pilot's license, you know, that had a gyroscope in it that had to be calibrated on the ground. In other words, you cage the instrument while you are on the ground, and caging is simply nothing more than setting the azimuth into the gyroscope while it's calibrated on a level surface on the ground. And when you cage it, that's the last place that you calibrate your gyros. Once you take off, the gyros continuously run, and the only thing that you correct is heading due to magnetic declination. And this is something that's a routine practice for pilots. But the bottom line is that if there were any curvature at all, not only would the gyroscope detect it in an airplane, it would detect that ridiculous amount of curvature that I was talking about earlier, that you'd have to be compensating at the rate of 2,800 foot per minute in a standard jet airliner. But guess what? The gyroscope simply does not detect that. Why doesn't it detect it? Because there's no curvature to the Earth. End of story. There's so many things that prove this, and anybody that thinks that there is any modification going on to the gyroscopic mechanism itself that is modifying for the curvature of the Earth is deluded, and they simply have not done their homework and looked into these, strange phenomena that everybody's touting called Schuler tuning, or the air discharge veins at the bottom of the gyroscopic gimbal structure. Doesn't exist. Doesn't exist. Didn't exist 30 years ago when I got my pilot's license. You are never, ever trained to compensate for Coriolis, curvature of the Earth. You are never trained on the instruments. In fact, it is the very nature of the instruments to fight any sort of curvature or turning away from anything that is perfectly flat level. There are a million people that are going to come back with a million rebuttals to this, and I say bring them on, because whatever you bring back, I would suggest you really research it deeply, and then fine. If you find something that's great, present it to me. I will be happy to personally debate this with you, because I've done, for the last 3 weeks, I've done nothing but research this, and I'm telling you, the gyroscopes, contrary to the people in the chat that are claiming that they prove the ball Earth, do anything but that. They prove the flat Earth. Not only do they prove the flat Earth, but they prove the motionless flat Earth.